Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Katie Kirchgasler, she, her, and I first want to thank Shada and everyone who made this STEM Ed speaker series possible. It's an honor to be in conversation with you all today. I look forward to your questions and insights as all of this work is still in progress. So today I want to share a bit from two studies co-authored with my colleague, Dr. Diego Roman, and our advisee, Cynthia Baeza. We gratefully acknowledge support for this work from the National Academy of Education, Spencer, and also UW-Madison's OVCR and WARF. I also want to say that what drives my work is my experiences teaching 5th and 6th graders in East Boston and Chelsea. And I want to thank them as well as the SEEDS community of science educators, my colleagues in the department, and all of our students who have really deepened this collective work. Okay. Science education, like many fields, has embraced a narrative of linear progress, continually reforming how we teach science to meet the needs of more and more students. That narrative recognizes that the field has historically failed to serve all, but believes it's always been working toward greater inclusion. My work questions this narrative. I use a historicizing approach to ask how research, policies, and pedagogies have been complicit in projecting students onto hierarchies of humanness, creating new exclusions in efforts to include. So to rethink US science education as a site that projects difference onto hierarchies, we really have to unbury histories of a settler, colonial, and imperial state. Historical research has largely assumed that very little science education was occurring in segregated and colonial settings. Yet, as many have explored, these sites were integral to schooling's role in policing boundaries of American citizenship and whiteness, very much live issues at the present moment. Taking that historical racialization seriously requires looking beyond culprits of teachers' implicit biases or power structures outside education. I'm trying to understand how the very tools and theories that induct new teachers and researchers into our profession carry assumptions of a forgotten, segregated, and colonial past, and therefore can really easily reanimate their racializing effects. Critical scholars in our field have already spotted pernicious effects of scientific racism, discriminatory testing, and militarized neoliberal STEM reforms. To complement this work, I look at efforts devoted to countering that cold rationality by instead promoting community well-being or social equality. My concern is that racialization operates not just through gatekeeping mechanisms, but also through good intentions to include and empower. Remaining vigilant to these dangers requires placing equity reforms in context with earlier efforts, also rooted in deep moral concern, to ask what each presumes about its targets of intervention, and to spotlight unintended consequences. So today I want to share snippets from two studies. The first with Cynthia. We're mapping racializing hierarchies that result in what we call the paradox of conditional inclusion. The second with Diego is asking how science learners' languages have been perceived as either a problem, a right, or a resource. And we point to a different paradox that we argue matters for efforts to support translanguaging in science education today. From Americanization to equity. So Cynthia in my study speaks to two key concerns of the field. The first is exclusion. Robust research has demonstrated that linguistically and racially minoritized students are more likely to experience segregation into separate, lower track courses with restricted access to academic content and greater surveillance of their daily lives and language. Second, on the right, is that when minoritized students do gain access to advanced science or STEM majors, they often encounter linguistic racism and assimilationist demands to self-police according to monolingual and monoglossic norms. We argue that both of these problems, exclusion and assimilationist norms, stem from a century-long history of US science education, one that creates a paradox of conditional inclusion. Calls to make children more scientist-like inherit norms that divide and order students on a hierarchy, where efforts to make some equal separate them and attempt to make them more the same. Theoretically, here's what we're trying to do. So the broad paradigm of most educational research, and including science education research, is how can we better support X category of students in moving from the margins of science education to the center. So here are two examples of categories, even though we know that racial and ethnic groups does not refer to a subset of people. It's often treated as though only a subset of students belong to racial and ethnic groups, and therefore they need some sort of intervention or extra supports to bring them closer to the center of science education. Also, this category of English language learners is now very much disputed, but still remains in some of the science education policy as a target group to be included. So thinking with Toni Morrison's book, Playing in the Dark, she asks for an inversion of the paradigm. So rather than assume that these groups have simply been excluded and have had no effect on the field until recently, she asks for American literature, and we ask for science education. How has this field elevated some as a normative center by making up others as needing rescue to qualify as an articulate student, a healthy citizen, or a future scientist? So we're looking really at how has research policy or teacher education actually produced these categories and then matched them with different kinds of instructional strategies. And we want to know, how did these dividing practices and norms come to be? Methodologically, we're borrowing from Nelson Flores's approach of raciolinguistic genealogy. This approach first is to turn scrutiny from the distinct kinds of students, starting from that premise, to the modes of perception that produce these racializing linguistic distinctions. So we're asking, how have teachers been trained to see and hear some students as potential scientists and others as not yet healthy citizens, and thus matching them with different kinds of science education aims and methods? And second, we want to situate the contemporary hierarchies in their colonial histories. So we specifically are looking at this era of US segregated, quote, Mexican schools for Mexican American students from around 1912 to 1947, when we are asking, how were those teachers trained to see and hear categories that were at the time phrased as Latin races or foreign students whose native tongue was Spanish? Those students were classified as future citizens, but not these embryo scientists that were often ascribed to giftedness or genius. And so we're trying to understand how those categories of race and language were made up and then matched with different kinds of assumptions about them as science learners. Crucially, as historians of Chicane education have explored, this segregation of Mexican American students did not end in 1947 with the Mendez court ruling. In fact, their classification as legally white but socially Mexican meant that separating these students en masse had always been illegal. That created a demand for social science tools to assess individual needs, tools designed to produce data verifying the deficits already presumed to lie in their minds, homes, and outlooks. Those tools would take on new purposes post-Mendez and the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, because they offered flexible sorting strategies that didn't refer to race, but still gave means of resegregating students into tracked courses and special education programs by displaying differences in their purported learning needs, health needs, affective needs, and linguistic needs. In fact, tracking and segregated schooling have long been interrelated. As David Garcia and colleagues highlight, the 1920s and 30s saw the invention of Mexican schools within schools, as the, quote, brightest, cleanest Mexican children were invited to join classrooms of their Anglo peers. We've noticed that comparative racialization play out within classrooms as well. Teachers were trained to appoint the healthiest Mexican American children as hygiene inspectors of their classmates. Through that eugenic, hygienic lens, teachers were to monitor which individuals achieved 100% personal efficiency, reclassifying them as effectively white. So what we're discussing as racialization then wasn't about fixed traits, but the malleability of habits and attitudes that were treated as evidence of children becoming more like scientists. The construct of needs racialized students by projecting distances between this idealized, consummately scientific and healthy Anglo self and this equally made up other, where only the latter's lives were flagged for inspection. And so we call this the hierarchy of perceived needs because we don't take any of these needs for granted, but are looking at these social science tools that are actually making needs appear as a distance from this norm. And some students then get classified with future needs that match them with abstract or advanced opportunities, while others are being categorically diagnosed with immediate needs, and they're being matched with concrete science applied to their daily life and health. So we're arguing here that critiques of deficit thinking are not enough. Invoking the child's potential to become scientist-like still is racializing some as not yet healthy citizens, and that's made tracking appear as if it were an equitable response to the needs that are being projected onto their minds, their homes, their cultures. And in so doing, that's reinstating this paradox that calls to make students equal, as in equally scientist-like, are separating them and offering them a different form of school science, often lower prestige, to try to make them more the same. Thankfully, the past does not determine the present. Several critical projects have broken out of that hierarchy, like Daniel Morales Doyle's AP Chemistry class, investigating impacts of environmental racism alongside El Vejo community organizers. There, they're scrutinizing industrial pollution rather than individual choices. But by and large, such an approach remains the exception that proves the rule. We're arguing that that hierarchy of perceived needs is negatively impacting students placed at both ends. On the one end, racially and linguistically minoritized students, often diagnosed as needing cultural or sociopolitical topics simply as motivating strategies, tend to be steered away from college preparatory or pre-medical tracks. Meanwhile, those predominantly white pre-med students receive a decontextualized, depoliticized science education. So it never asks them to grapple with the sociopolitical of science, like medical apartheid or environmental health inequities. I'm currently working with a team to explore how higher education chemistry might also rethink how these inherited norms of academic rigor, including the eugenic history of grading on a curve, not only contribute to STEM pushout at the higher ed level, but also the pushout of any of those contextualized sociopolitical dimensions of chemical interactions, pushing them into non-majors or special topics courses. Meanwhile, I started realizing that in examining this racializing hierarchy of needs, I had yet to closely pay attention to language, and that's where Diego's and my collaboration began. Language as resource. Why science education's raciolinguistic histories matter for translanguaging today. Our study responds to a recent call to begin critiquing and deconstructing language hierarchies that continue having power over multilingual students' language and how it's viewed and treated in science education. Many have been pushing our field to move beyond notions of equity as access, to start rethinking equity or justice as demanding deeper, more systemic transformations. Our study is trying to explore how language has been conceptualized in US science education, how multilingual students' languages have been treated as deficits or assets for science learning, and the ongoing impact of those practices and premises for the field today. Specifically, we're going to argue that when the term translanguaging entered science education research around the 2010s, it did not enter a vacuum, but a field that was replete with histories of enforcing, but also contesting, raciolinguistic hierarchies and norms. So translanguaging pedagogies, here's an edited volume from 2022. These pedagogies as a science education strategy largely seek to turn from treating students' languaging as a deficit to an asset, or from a problem to a resource. And the goal is to recognize the richness of students' once devalued linguistic and semiotic resources for science learning. So we, along with others, are starting to ask, okay, but what tensions are arising when we try to bring these pedagogies into our field, given the historical and sociopolitical conditions of schooling? For instance, we often teach in schools that are still enacting exclusionary and leveled tracking. This is Ilana Umansky's work documenting how students classified as English learners are often placed in lower track courses, that's the leveled, or ESL science courses that are separate from this college preparatory science coursework. Also, scholars have documented the linguistic apartheid that results, linguistic racism that students experience in those courses, and linguistic imperialism, especially Anglo-normativity, in terms of how science education is taught and assessed worldwide. So in treating language as a resource, to what extent are we interrogating, first, the criteria by which that richness is appraised, and second, the ends to which those resources are being leveraged? Already, there have been key cautions raised about instrumentalizing translanguaging as a stepping stone to normality, rather than disrupting what counts as high prestige academic or scientific language, and also concerns about distorting translanguaging by jettisoning its decolonial lens. So as critical lenses, rather than just pedagogical strategies, translanguaging theories are actually disputing three things. One, the presumed discreteness of named languages, so the assumption that L1 is a completely separate system than L2 or English versus Spanish, for instance. The assumed neutrality of disciplinary learning, so in our case, the content and standards of science. And third, the assimilationist schooling aims that reinforce societal hierarchies. So as Ofelia Garcia and colleagues have argued, reducing translanguaging to a pedagogical support strategy, an efficient means to an already established end, evacuates its core critiques of sociopolitical conditions, including ongoing colonial histories. Raciolinguistic perspectives go on to dispute how educational reforms often place the onus of change on minoritized learners to modify their speech, while exonerating the discriminatory ways that researchers and educators are still being trained to see those speakers and to hear that speech along hierarchies of value. So our argument is that language as a resource might seem the opposite of language as a problem, but a different story appears if we examine US science instruction across colonial and segregated schools that were explicitly promoting Americanization. US science education has repeatedly posited multilingual children's languages as simultaneously a problem and a resource, one useful in bringing them closer to universalized norms of productive citizenship. Our concern is that without critical hindsight, translanguaging could easily be reduced to more efficient strategies of refining human beings, accommodations for subgroups to help them assimilate to systems that remain otherwise unjust. So why language? Language has long served as a site to refine those seen or heard as unruly, unpolished, or unscientific. You can see a more humorous example on the left with My Fair Lady and a pronunciation lesson to turn this flower girl into somebody who can pass in court. But more seriously, entire communities' languages have been slated for elimination in settler colonial schools that were claiming to modernize or scientize the minds of Indigenous, Mexican-American, or African-American children, among others. For centuries, a core means of marking enslaved or colonized peoples as if they were irrational, uncivilized, or subhuman was to demean their languages as immature, or specifically as inappropriate for science. Today, many students, teachers, and practitioners of science remain subjected to pressures to reduce their perceived accents or self-police their translingual practices. Crucially, people have continually refused, resisted, and worked to repudiate those linguistic hierarchies, including within science education. You can see here Rosa Navarro, who, as a Mexican-American, was trying to reform Puerto Rican science instruction and wrote in both English and Spanish about the importance of building on la herencia cultural puertorriqueña, including idiomas, but also everything else that the school science curriculum was excluding. Research questions. So we wanted to know in this study, first, how did early 1900s US science ed begin separating languages and speakers on these hierarchies of value? Second, what really changed with the mid-1900s rise of bilingual education reforms? And third, what dangers do inherited hierarchies and norms pose to translanguaging reforms today? To approach these questions, we started reviewing the existing literature and trying to identify what we started thinking about as refinery mechanisms, practices that produce language hierarchies and norms by dividing students as having raw versus already refined resources. So the first is named hierarchies of named languages. So the premise that English, for instance, or specifically standardized dominant American English is somehow more scientific or more academic than any other variety of English or any other named language. Monoglossic norms refers to the idea that these languages should be held separate. And so speaking quote unquote pure English or Spanish just one at a time is often perceived as or heard as more academic, more scientific, more professional than translanguaging across those artificial borders. Third, we identified how, building on many other scholars' work, science education research specifically has continually classified some language as scientific and contrasted it with something they call either everyday, home, out of school, non-academic, or street language. And those hierarchies are very much interrelated with the first two. And finally, we identified, building on the work of Guadalupe Valdez, the curricularization of language aims and how in science ed specifically, oftentimes the abstracted forms of linguistic structures associated with science, so a classic example would be stoichiometry, is treated as kind of the highest tier, most prestigious or rigorous form of science language, and it's considered only accessible to some students, whereas everybody is expected to learn these applied language functions that, for instance, in the current standards, you can think about as the linguistic practices of the scientific or engineering practices, so evidence-based argumentation, for instance. So these positionings of some languages as more scientific than others or more rigorously scientific, they are mutually reinforcing, and they also highlight the role of science in what Daniel Morales Doyle and Kenneth Booker call the extractive politics of STEM education, trying to treat students and refine them as if they were human resources for development. So we also wanted to build on the ongoing conversations of Ruiz and Flores and Leonard and others in the language fields who have already raised concerns about this idea of treating language simply as a resource or as a sort of capitalizing on it as an asset. So the current concerns they raise are, first, commodifying language as a resource can actually undermine efforts to reclaim languages as a right or an act of sovereignty. And they may reinstate these European colonial logics by appraising languages for their enhancement of an entrepreneurial self or nation state. And second, even asset-based reforms may retain norms of disciplinary appropriateness or communicative competence. And in so doing, they really keep the onus on the minoritized students to modify their speech patterns rather than on the system to disrupt those institutionalized listening practices. And that's what led us to try to think about this as a refinery paradox, that even these efforts to prove the utility of students' resources within the existing practices of valuation may reject certain norms and hierarchies while reinstating others. So for instance, treating translanguaging as a support strategy may challenge the monoglossic norm of saying you only can speak one language at a time in the science classroom, but the end goal may still be the same in terms of what you're trying to move students towards and toward what ends. So similarly, our methodology in this study is raciolinguistic genealogy, building on Nelson Flores's work. And in this case, we wanted to look at the hypervisibility of Spanish, because Spanish in the United States was spoken in the lands we now call the US since before the nation's founding. yet it's frequently been flagged as if it's foreign or as if it inherently posed a pedagogical problem. And that hypervisibility then helps us trace subtle shifts in otherwise implicit language norms, like that everyone has to speak standardized English in a monolingual setting. And so we use the keyword Spanish to run that through the 3 longest running science education journals in the United States. And you can see here on the left that these various categories were associated with the term Spanish over time. And then we did a process of citational backmapping to say, okay, if they're referring to, for instance, unacculturated Spanish Americans in this time period, what studies are they citing? And then looking up those studies. And that led us to different digitized archives of curricular reforms that were being referenced in our field's journals. So in the early 1900s, we looked at science instruction in US segregated Mexican schools, but also colonial schools in Puerto Rico. And in mid-century, you start to see, especially in the 1960s, compensatory science education reforms that now targeted Black students, as well as what were termed Spanish surname students, that their last names sounded Spanish, and that flagged them as potentially needing this more remedial form of science instruction. Similarly, around the same time period, but quite different, were bilingual science education reforms that were starting to unfold in both Puerto Rico and New York City, among other places. So one important point is that this form of history is not attempting to tell an objective, neutral, or totalizing story of everything that happened in the past century. And in fact, it's really important to recognize that our distinct situated perspectives also shaped what called attention to us in terms of what to pay attention to and how to follow those connections and what to prioritize. So I'll just share my own, but I was raised monolingual, and to think of myself as white in a white flight suburb of the United States, specifically on the unceded Onondaga lands outside of what is now Syracuse, New York. And that meant I initially thought very little about my own, what some scholars call my own raciolinguicized subjectivity, that I just heard my own English as if it were normal. And I was schooled to see language as an academic investment, right? Not something that's part of my identity, not something that connects me to broader communities. So for instance, I chose Latin in part to help prepare me for college admissions tests and future STEM courses. And it wasn't until subsequent engagement with critical scholarship that it really sharpened my attention to how I did learn Spanish late in life in college, but that became credited to me, even though I wouldn't consider myself fully fluent. It was credited to me as if it were a competitive bonus on my resume, at the same time that the 6th graders and 5th graders I was teaching, their Dominican, Ecuadorian, Mexican, or US Spanishes were largely treated as if they were a barrier to their success. And you can see then the racializing of language in how it was credited to me as an advantage and to them as a disadvantage. And so that really was part of the reason that I went to grad school in the first place. And when I met Diego, that was an amazing way to dig deeper into these histories that I had not been thinking about. And it was Diego who introduced me to raciolinguistic perspectives. So I'll let Diego's slide speak for itself, but it was really in conversation with each other and also with the teachers we're in touch with, the students in our seminars, that we were trying to wrestle with what of these histories matters for today. How do these colonial and imperial histories remain materially consequential for students, their families, and their science teachers today? So I'll just give you a brief highlight of the analysis in our paper, but we're basically arguing that the refinery mechanisms I mentioned earlier that mark some languages as a problem versus others as scientific, those have been periodically upgraded. So you don't see the same deficit language, for instance, over time. Second, treating language as a resource is not new or even necessarily progressive. And so we will show a couple examples of that. And then third, we spent most of our time digging into this rare mid-century reform that was seeking to sustain bilingualism in their students as a strength and to really challenge some of the hierarchies mentioned above, but it also suggested some cautions for today, and we call that the refinery paradox. Okay, so first, the refinery mechanisms that we're looking at here, it's really important to recognize that there is no such thing as a pre-existing scientific language, right? Many languages have been used in what are called the sciences over time. But in US science education research, which is where these quotes are from, there's a making kind of this invention of a homogenized scientific language, and the way it's the boundaries are drawn around that language are continually by idealizing something as more scientific, precisely by casting something else as its opposite. And so what you see here in the early 1900s is explicit eugenic theories are invoked to argue that purified, enlightened tools of civilized races is what the English language offers, and it positions the English of native Anglo speakers as offering the richest storehouse of Greco-Roman scientific thought. This idea that the kind of eugenic superiority of Greco-Roman sciences was directly communicated to and stored within the English language, and especially native speakers of that language. And that was contrasted with what scholars of the time termed passive, savage mother tongues, or the unworthy speech habits of unintelligent homes. So for instance, sociologists went into various immigrant groups' homes and noted when they were switching languages. So for instance, between English and Polish, and that was classified by those sociologists as language monstrosities. So, right, so you could see the treating of what we'd now call translanguaging as if it were an illness, a pathology, something that indicated a lack of intelligence. And in science education research, then in this bottom box, you can see that Spanish specifically is heard as if it were contaminating pure English. That's the eugenic theory of bastardized languages, that the mixing of languages was seen as something that was akin to racial or linguistic degeneration. It was an index of mental confusion, or the limited control that an assumed limited control of students' language that also was assumed to indicate that they had little control over their daily lives, and thus they purportedly needed these concrete applied forms of science education. So then if we flip over to the post-World War II era, these eugenic theories are no longer acceptable. And so you have a different cybernetic set of theories and methods that are now ascribing science as a linguistic style that's the unique product of advanced Western countries, with English being posited as this international language. And it's contrasted then with what until the 1990s were still being classified as non-intellectualized languages. Now, linguists know that there is no such thing as a non-intellectualized language, that all languages are intellectual, but these classifications, you can see, have this longer history of assumptions they're inheriting. And language as a problem discourses in science education, now you see Spanish being classified as if it's a crutch or a sign of cognitive and linguistic handicap. And so that disability language is really prominent in this time. And so these students are being classified as if they have verbal deprivation that's related to what were classified as culturally deprived homes. And again, students under those categories are then being prescribed this applied lower tier science instruction. So it wasn't just that students' languages or multilingual students or Spanish specifically was seen as a problem this whole century. Importantly, from the early 1900s, we saw surprising examples of Spanish being actually promoted as a resource within US science teaching. And specifically, you can see on the left here that immigrant students in Chicago were being asked to translate hygiene posters for their parents and neighbors into Spanish based on eugenic theories that these were less enlightened races. And so the resource of Spanish is being used to reach populations that the science education scholars had kind of fears about. And similarly, and that was, of course, based on eugenic theories of diseased races and less intelligent races. And not attending to, for instance, conditions of tenements at the time and the policy reasons for differential health outcomes. Secondly, from a purely utilitarian point of view, Puerto Rican teachers were asked to make a strategic use of Spanish, not to make scientists, but that was a quote, but instead invoking eugenic theories to make the Puerto Rican pupil, quote, normal in health and thus increase their economic productiveness. So you can see here that language is a resource, but it's just to target families and communities into this like hygienic, productive citizen, which is distinguished from goals of actually advancing in scientific coursework in the future. Then by the mid-1900s, you actually see the rise of institutionalized bilingual education in the United States. Most of those programs were what are termed transitional. So the goal was to temporarily use students' home language or first language and then transition them fully to English. And so we see lots of examples of science education encouraging teachers or nonprofit professionals to translate museum exhibits and curriculum and textbooks into Spanish in order to, quote, overcome language barriers and value conflicts to reform those groups, right? So similarly to the past, the assumption is that the barrier is within the child and the family, and we're only tactically, instrumentally using their language and their full linguistic repertoire only for the purposes of getting them away from that, ultimately. There was one really rare example of a language maintenance program, as in the goal was to maintain students' Spanish as well as English. And that's what we'll look at next. So this rare case took place in New York City in the 1960s. You can see on the top right, science instruction in Spanish for pupils of Spanish-speaking background and experiment in bilingualism. And there were Puerto Rican science education scholars who were part of the design of this study. They hired a lot of Spanish-speaking teachers and taught science in Spanish. And so what's really striking about this for us is that this was decades before the term translanguaging even existed, let alone entered science ed. And yet a lot of the specific proposals and what they implemented in this program, they were refusing monolingual, monoglossic norms. They were promoting the flexible use of students' full repertoires. For instance, over on the left, you can see there was the easy and permissive transition from one language to the other. So not half the day in English, half the day in Spanish, but recognizing that multilingual people naturally move across their languages unless they're schooled or policed not to. And then this program affirmed Puerto Rican students' language explicitly by trying to revalue the science in linking it to this high prestige subject matter of science. So besides just trying to sustain the Spanish language itself, we were really interested in how the authors of this report were trying to contest some of the hierarchies that were taken for granted across everything else we found. So, for instance, they reimagined the ultimate aims of science education, naming bilingualism and biculturalism will be encouraged for all as an aspect of excellence, which will benefit our nation. They were explicitly flipping deficit ascriptions. So where I mentioned before, verbal deprivation theories were saying that the family or the child was verbally deprived. They were arguing, no, it's the US economy that's deprived if the schools do not help sustain the language talents of Puerto Rican and immigrant students. And they went on to challenge structural policies, which is very rare in US science education research in this time period and before, saying that English-only policies and assimilationist education was failing to capitalize on the vast reservoir of linguistic ability in these particular students. And so on the one hand, you see this contesting of these hierarchies, which is really surprising and exciting to see. And also what struck Diego and I was this term capitalizing on the vast reservoir of linguistic ability also resonated with these assumptions of a reservoir, like an oil reservoir, these dormant commodities that could be extracted, refined, and put to use for the benefit of the nation. And so that kind of provoked us to pay closer attention to what were the ways that these assets were being conceptualized. And so that led us to look really closely at, in trying to prove their program's societal value, the study actually claimed to capitalize on the assets in order to address perceived needs. So, for instance, economic realities were cited as making students need to learn English quite pressing. Second, they argued that they needed to raise students' self-image, morale, and aspirations by nurturing pride in their Spanish origins. And so that contextually is, rather than simply nurturing pride for its own sake, the justification was based on this prevalent damage paradigm that you see in the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, which is the premise of psychological damage from prejudice, and therefore needing to improve self-esteem as the focus of a lot of these civil rights era reforms. And then third, the need for cultural retention. So they actually developed a new scale to measure students' retention of their Puerto Rican culture, was to prevent students in, quote, the ghetto from succumbing to a potentially dangerous social state in an environment fraught with cultural deprivation, end quote. So you see the explicit invocation of racialized terminology, but also these culture of poverty theories as the basis for arguing there's a need for cultural retention, not culturally sustaining for its own sake, but because if not, these fears of what will happen to populations that are cut off from their culture too soon. And that has a long colonial legacy. It's also part of a broader pattern. Other science education reforms of this time were funded by both the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but also juvenile delinquency acts. And so you can see how it's very difficult to categorize some of these reforms along a progressive conservative ideological spectrum, because the actual social science theories and techniques are continually positioning diversity as this potential perversity, as Gloria Ladson-Billings puts it, a potential criminality, a potential pathology, and never questioning the norm against which everyone's being compared. The further irony is that this Science in Spanish report was actually one of the key evidence offered to support the 1968 Bilingual Education Act. But that legislative act then reframed what the authors of this report called language talents as, quote, special educational needs. And that speaks to a very long history of the racializing of disability in and beyond science education, where it treats anything that's different from the norm as a potential disability that has to be kind of reformed or corrected. And so that led us to think about this as a paradox, because efforts to prove the utility of students' language resources within these existing practices rejected certain norms and hierarchies, but it also reinstated others. And so that gives us a lot of pause for today to think about, even in our best intentioned efforts, what else do we need to be paying attention to when we invoke the needs of our students, for instance. So we'll come back now then to Toni Morrison, a 1989 quote that Beth Warren and colleagues used to kind of launch a really important paper, Rethinking Disciplinary Multiplicity. And Toni Morrison states that canon building is empire building. So canon like a weapon, but canon also like the stabilized, kind of fabricated notion of one set of pure knowledge that has to be learned. And so we argue that what has been canonized as science learning and science language are products of these refinery mechanisms that have been inherited from our field's colonial and segregated past. So even though there have been updates, which are of course important, we're glad we're not in the eugenic early 1900s, Similar mechanisms are still dividing students and their languaging as either already valued national resources or raw resources needing improvement. So our concern is that so long as research, policy, and assessment systems keep operating that machinery, it's unlikely that the uptake of translanguaging itself will substantially disrupt all of those hierarchies and homogenized ideals. So where's the hope? First, as there's always been, we know the irrepressible resolve of young children, youth, families, and communities that are determined to keep striving for a more just world that is capable of sustaining all of our human and more than human relations. Second, these refinery mechanisms of school science are little more than a century old. So like the oil refinery, they're human inventions, and they're overrepresenting themselves, in Sylvia Wynter's words, as if they were a strategic necessity. So by unsettling their inevitability, we can better grapple with the roles that translanguaging and other justice-centered approaches might play in dismantling these hierarchies within and beyond our field. And finally, as pessimistic as this talk may sound, it's grounded in a deep optimism. As Nicole Hannah-Jones put it in 2021, the sharp rise in anti-history laws across the country, and today we can add attempts to ban books, censor teachers, shut down ethnic studies, gender studies, sociology courses. All of these remind us that history is about power. It's a means of control, of shaping what we'll accept as a society. And through history, we realize that all these things that have been taken as natural are constructed. So why are states banning curricula, Hannah-Jones asks? Because once people know the architecture that built this inequality, they know how to deconstruct it. So I'll thank you and leave it there, but I look forward to your questions, and any and all mistakes are my own in this talk, but I really appreciate all of the people on the slide and you all for your thoughts.
Thank you, Dr. Kirchgasler. This was very intriguing. You presented several evidence of the history, the hierarchies of language ideologies. So we have about 10 minutes for questions and comments. Anything from the audience, just feel free to jump in. You can also put in the chat box too. I shared some of the questions earlier with you from my class. I think you already answered some of them, but if you could maybe more elaborate on the strategies, like what is the next, this is the question I think I'm having, just hearing different ideologies, but there's some common racism I can see, from the evidence you presented, how it can connect to these, bigger ideologies to prevent some groups to get more advanced science education, for example, or math education, maybe. In my education too, I'm thinking what would be the equivalent of this research. And I have many questions, but maybe for the translanguaging one, you said this is the newest, I think, idea of but you said it's also used as a support mechanism, not necessarily natural organic process. So how does it look like in a science classroom when students use translanguage, and what would be the approach from teachers, or what should be the approach from teachers? How do you see this ideology operate in the future? For example, does it imply becoming multilingual for other peoples as well, to improve the communication between different groups?
That's a great question.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first on the math ed part, I would say that I've worked closely with colleagues in math ed. So Aisha Yolgu, Ryan Ziles, and Jennifer Diaz. I encourage everyone to look up their work. They've really been trying to trace these same kinds of making of hierarchies in math ed specifically. But in terms of translanguaging, there's been really exciting work in science ed, work by Enrique Suarez and Luis Poza and Maria Gonzalez Howard and many others who are really working very closely with teachers and students, and kind of documenting the ways that students are already doing like using translanguaging all the time. And that's there's international work on that. There's a whole research team, Dr. Charamba and colleagues in South Africa, and there's a whole research team that is looking at how translanguaging is so often happening, but previously it has not been attended to, or it has been positioned as a problem, like the switching back and forth was treated as kind of a sign that students aren't learning. So first of all, it's already happening in a lot of spaces. And secondly, there's lots of ways that teachers can support translanguaging. For instance, modeling translanguaging. So when I work with my pre-service teachers, I'll model some translanguaging, like moving across English and Spanish. And I think one of the things that's really striking to me is that even in kids shows right now, where previously if they ever used a Spanish word, they would put, in closed captions, and they would kind of treat it as a big problem if an English monolingual couldn't understand a single word that was said in a kids show. Now there's shows like Primos that are like kids are translanguaging across English and Spanish, and there's no captions, and my kid who doesn't speak Spanish understands it perfectly fine. Like, right, like there's something gained if you do understand it, but there's also something beautiful of allowing students to bring their whole repertoires to that space. And so in science language or science instruction, but also there's work on translanguaging and actively modeling it and encouraging it in science assessments. And so I encourage people to look up Caitlin Fine and colleagues' work on that. And yeah, so all of those things are happening. And then I would say, in addition to supporting translanguaging, part of what Diego and I are very interested in is then to what ends is the translanguaging happening? And are we also calling into question some of those hierarchies and norms, and in terms of who is represented as a scientist, and whether science is presented as this politically, culturally neutral field that's decontextualized, or if instead a lot of the principles that I teach in my methods course are drawing on Daniel Morales-Doyle's work on justice-centered science pedagogies that can do a both and of academic rigor and sociopolitical and scientific relevance. Yeah. So I guess I'll pause there. Oh, and I would say, sorry, in addition to translanguaging, we talk about decentering English monolingualism. And so not leaving any of your students, even if you only teach English monolinguals, with the impression that scientists all speak English and only English, right? So there's many ways you can bring in little videos of scientists who are translanguaging themselves or who are speaking other languages as experts that your students can learn from, so that to decenter that premise of who is a scientist and what does a scientist sound like.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And there's one question in the chat box from Ryan. His question is more about if also you look at how Asian Americans were impacted by negative conceptions around their languages in science.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. So there's been a real momentum around rethinking how kind of the category of Asian American and Asian have been treated in science education research. So I would point you to, let me find the exact title of the paper for you. So it is, okay, so Matthew Wolfgram and colleagues, along with Stacy Lee, Chendu Her, and colleagues, they have a paper called STEM Asianization and the Racialization of the Educational Experiences of Asian American College Students, working specifically with Hmong Americans. And so raciolinguistic hierarchies in higher ed STEM is definitely on their radar, and they're working through kind of the multiple empires of imperial histories that have shaped how Asian and Asian Americans have been positioned in US science education research and policy. Also, there's a paper that I would really recommend that is about sort of rethinking these model minority myths and how Asian American students specifically are positioned as kind of needing to perform a certain form of kind of perceived competence linguistically and kind of academically, and the ways in which that has all sorts of racializing effects, exclusionary and assimilationist effects. And so I know there's a team of researchers with Minjung Ru and colleagues thinking about that as well. So I'd really encourage you to reach out to them. And yeah, but this is something that is both in the raciolinguistic literature and in the science ed literature, to not assume that oftentimes the Asian American category has just been lumped into or invisibilized with whiteness, with the category of white. And so there's ways in which that is especially harmful to many students and to science.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kirchgasler. Just to be mindful of everyone's time, I just want to go ahead and wrap up the session. So it was really, intriguing presentation, and new ideas are definitely, I heard a lot of new things in this talk. Thank you so much, and sharing the resources with us, and hope to see you in the future again. And thank you all, everyone who is attending to today's talks.